The fence is clearly out of regulation. I built that fence with my own hands.
Then you'll need to tear it down and rebuild it properly.
This is ridiculous.
Consider this a final warning.
Tear that thing down by Monday, Grant, or I'll make sure this neighborhood buries you in legal fees. Vivian Holloway said it loud enough for 14 people holding paper plates and wine glasses to hear her from across my backyard deck. The lake wind carried her voice clean over the wet cedar fence I'd spent 3 weekends building with my own hands. Somebody near the grill stopped talking mid-sentence. Somebody else awkwardly looked down into their beer. That's the thing about HOA power people never tell you. They don't just want control. They want witnesses. The cold evening air rolling off Blackwater Lake smelled like rain and damp pine needles, and thunder muttered somewhere far out over the mountains while Vivian stood there in cream-colored boots that had never seen real mud in their entire expensive lives. She held a folded compliance notice between 2 manicured fingers like she was presenting evidence in court. 72 hours, she said with that polished realtor smile. Then the county gets involved. I looked past her toward the massive glass-railed balcony attached to her 3-story lake house sitting uphill behind mine. Every light in her house was on. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Perfect angle straight into my backyard. Straight into my kitchen. Straight into the place where my wife used to sit before she died. Suddenly the whole thing made sense. The fence wasn't ruining her view. It was ruining her access. If you've ever had somebody smile at you while threatening your home, comment below with your city and tell me where you're watching from tonight, because what happened after this nearly destroyed an entire HOA board. Nobody at that barbecue said a word after Vivian handed me the notice. Rain started tapping softly against the metal roof over my back patio, while people suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Pickup truck doors slammed along the gravel driveway one after another. Tires crunched wet stone. Within 3 minutes the yard was empty except for me, Vivian, and the smell of cedar soaked from incoming rain. She glanced at the fence again, slow and deliberate, like she was already imagining it torn apart. People move here for openness, Grant, she said quietly now. Softer voice. More dangerous somehow. Walls make neighbors uncomfortable. I took the folded paper from her hand without opening it. Funny, I said. I built it because uncomfortable neighbors kept staring into my property. Her smile tightened just enough for me to catch it. Tiny crack. Tiny shift. Then she recovered immediately. County inspectors won't care about your feelings. Maybe not. I looked out toward the dark water below the property line, where fog was beginning to gather over the shoreline docks. But they usually care about code. That landed harder than she expected. I could see it in her eyes. Just a flicker. Vivian Holloway was used to homeowners panicking, arguing, begging. What she wasn't used to was calm. Especially the kind of calm that comes from somebody who already knows something she doesn't. She turned and walked back toward the path leading uphill to her house, heels clicking sharply against wet stone. Halfway there, she stopped beside the fence and pressed her palm lightly against the cedar boards like she already owned them. You really should have checked who runs this neighborhood before building something this ugly. Then she disappeared into the fog rolling down from the ridge while thunder cracked louder over the lake. I stood there another minute listening to rain hit the fence, listening to water slap softly against the dock pilings below the shoreline. Then I finally unfolded the compliance notice under the patio light. And the second I saw the county reference code typed across the bottom of that page, I realized Vivian had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. Rain hammered the metal roof over my workshop most of that night, while I sat alone at the kitchen counter with the compliance notice beside a cold cup of coffee and a flashlight pointed at the county reference code Vivian had been arrogant enough to include. Outside, fog rolled low across Blackwater Lake, swallowing the fishing docks one by one until only the warning lights at the marina blinked faint red through the dark, like something underwater watching the shoreline. I barely slept. Every time thunder rattled the windows, I kept seeing my wife Elise standing in this same kitchen 3 years earlier pulling the blinds shut, because somebody from uphill had been watching our backyard through binoculars again. People hear the word privacy and think preference. They do not understand what it feels like after fear lives in your house long enough. By 5:30 that morning, I was already driving into county with a thermos of burnt gas station coffee, sitting beside me in the truck while cold rain hissed across the windshield. The courthouse annex sat near the river behind an old diner with flickering neon and a gravel parking lot full of muddy pickup trucks belonging to contractors waiting on permit approvals. Inside the diner, nobody talked much. Just forks scraping plates and weather reports muttering softly from a television over the counter while storm clouds turned the windows gray. I recognized two men from my subdivision sitting in a booth near the back. They recognized me too. One of them immediately looked down into his eggs. The other gave me that uncomfortable half-nod people use when they do not want to get involved, but still want credit for sympathy. Word had already spread overnight. Vivian made sure of that. By the time I reached the county zoning office 30 minutes later, the receptionist behind the glass already knew my address before I finished speaking. "Oh," she said carefully. "Lakeview Ridge dispute." Dispute. Funny word for somebody threatening your home in front of your neighbors. She disappeared into the back office and returned with a tall man in a Navy County jacket named Harold Becker, who smelled faintly of rainwater and old paper files. He studied the notice for about 10 seconds before letting out a slow breath through his nose. "Did Miss Holloway tell you this code applies to privacy fencing?" That seemed to be the implication. He glanced toward the ceiling like he was already exhausted. "It does not." That was the first real shift. Small, quiet, but real. Then he said something even more interesting. "Your property falls inside the elevated shoreline overlay district. Different standards up there." He walked me over to a large zoning map mounted along the wall and pointed toward my lot above the lake bend where the shoreline curved inward beneath the ridge. "Most homeowners never notice this designation because it rarely matters," he said. "But technically your property has enhanced privacy allowances due to line-of-sight exposure from elevated neighboring structures." I stared at the map while thunder rolled somewhere outside over the water. Enhanced privacy allowances. Vivian knew. She had to know. Suddenly her obsession with removing the fence felt less like HOA control and more like panic. Becker lowered his voice slightly. "Off the record, you are not the first resident from Lakeview Ridge who has come in here after complaints connected to Miss Holloway." There it was. Another layer. Another crack underneath the polished smile. On my way back out to the truck, I passed two women from the neighborhood, standing near the permit counter whispering beside a rack of wet umbrellas. One stopped talking the second she saw me. The other forced a smile too quickly. By noon, my phone had 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, and somebody had anonymously posted pictures of my fence inside the neighborhood social media group with the caption "community" or "compound." The comments were already turning ugly. But buried halfway down the thread was one sentence from an account with no profile picture. "Vivian has been inside more backyards around here than most landscapers." I read that twice, while rain pounded the truck roof hard enough to drown out the world for a few seconds. Then I folded the compliance notice back up slowly, and for the first time since this started, I stopped thinking about defending the fence. I started thinking about why Vivian Holloway was so desperate to see through it. The rain finally broke sometime after midnight, but the fog stayed wrapped tight over Blackwater Lake the next morning like the whole shoreline was holding its breath. I woke before sunrise to the sound of a pickup truck slowing down outside my gravel driveway. Not stopping, just slowing enough for somebody to stare, then rolling on. By 7 o'clock, there were tire tracks in the wet dirt shoulder near my mailbox where at least 3 different vehicles had pulled over during the night. Curious neighbors. Voyeurs. Maybe both. Funny how fast a quiet community turns into an audience once somebody smells conflict. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, and cold lake wind immediately cut through my flannel jacket. The cedar fence still glistened dark from the storm, beads of rainwater running slowly down the boards while fog drifted low across the shoreline below my property. For a few seconds, the whole yard felt peaceful again. Then I noticed the drone. Small, black, hovering maybe 40 feet above the fence line near the edge of the ridge. Watching. I did not wave. I just stood there staring directly at it until it tilted awkwardly and disappeared back uphill toward Vivian Holloway's property. That changed something in me. Quietly. Permanently. By mid-morning, the neighborhood social page had become a blood sport. Somebody uploaded edited pictures of my backyard with prison bars photoshopped over the fence. Another resident joked about me building a militia compound. People who had smiled at me for 2 years were suddenly comfortable performing for an online crowd because Vivian had made opposition socially profitable. But buried between the insults were cracks starting to show. One resident commented that Vivian herself had installed 6-foot privacy hedges around her own pool last summer. Another asked why the HOA suddenly cared about sightlines now when half the ridge houses blocked lake views already. The comment disappeared 20 minutes later. Deleted. I drove down to Morro's Bait and Marina around noon mostly because I needed air that did not smell like politics. The docks were slick from rain, old fishermen drinking coffee from thermoses while fog rolled over the water thick enough to erase the far shoreline completely. Nobody there cared about HOA drama. That helped. At least until Dale Morrow himself came out from behind the counter wiping his hands on a rag and said, "You picked one hell of a woman to get sideways with." Dale had lived near Blackwater Lake since the 70s. The kind of man who noticed everything and repeated very little. I asked him what he meant. He leaned against the bait freezer and looked out toward the water for a long moment before answering. "Vivian Holloway does not fight to win arguments," he said. "She fights to make people leave." That landed heavier than I expected. Then he told me about the Parkers, a retired couple from Chicago who sold their lake house 8 months after Vivian started filing complaints over their grandson's fishing boat being visible from the street. Before that, it was a contractor named Luis Mendoza who suddenly faced nonstop HOA fines right after refusing to redo Vivian's outdoor kitchen at a discount. Always different reasons. Same pattern. Pressure. Isolation. Exhaustion. Dale lowered his voice. "People think she protects property values. Truth is she protects control." Outside the marina windows, thunder rolled softly again somewhere behind the mountains while cold wind rattled the dock chains against metal posts. I sat there realizing this thing had already spread far beyond a fence dispute. Vivian had spent years building fear into the neighborhood, one homeowner at a time, and everybody had adjusted to it slowly enough that they stopped noticing how abnormal it was. But fear has a weakness. Once people see somebody resist it publicly, they start remembering what normal used to feel like. When I got back home that afternoon, another envelope was waiting inside my screen door. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single printed photograph taken from Vivian's upstairs balcony. My backyard. My kitchen windows. My patio furniture. And written across the bottom in neat blue ink were 6 words. "Beautiful view before the wall went up." I stared at that picture for a very long time while rain started tapping softly against the metal roof again. Then I walked over to the fence, ran my hand along the wet cedar boards, and finally understood the truth. Vivian Holloway had not been looking at the lake from her balcony. She had been looking into people's lives. That photograph sat on my kitchen counter all night while rain rolled across Blackwater Lake in slow waves that slapped against the shoreline docks below my property hard enough to echo through the fog. I tried sleeping twice. Failed both times. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up, pulled on a jacket, and walked outside into the cold, damp air with a flashlight and the picture in my hand. The beam cut across the cedar fence, across the wet grass, across my dark kitchen windows reflected faintly back at me. Vivian had taken that picture from uphill with a zoom lens. You could tell by the angle. You could also tell something else. It had not been taken recently. My old patio furniture was still in it. Elisa's flower pots were still sitting near the railing before I moved them after she died. Meaning Vivian had been photographing my property long before this fight started. That realization settled into my chest like lake ice. Not rage exactly. Worse. Violation. By sunrise, the fog had thickened so badly I could barely see the marina lights through the trees below the ridge. I drove down to the hardware supply store near County Road 17 mostly to clear my head, but the second I walked in, conversation stopped near the contractor desk. 3 men standing beside stacks of drywall suddenly became very interested in price tags. One woman near the paint aisle gave me an apologetic smile before turning away fast. Public opinion had shifted overnight. Not fully against me anymore. Worse for Vivian than hatred is curiosity. Once people start wondering whether the powerful person is lying, the whole machine gets unstable. On my way back home, my phone rang from an unknown number. Female voice. Nervous. "Do not say my name," she said immediately. Rain crackled softly through the line behind her like she was sitting in a parked car. Vivian keeps copies. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder near the old fishing access road overlooking the muddy shoreline and listened while lake wind rocked the truck slightly. The woman told me Vivian monitored neighborhood complaints obsessively, saved screenshots, tracked personal disputes, collected details about divorces, financial stress, medical problems. She likes leverage. the woman whispered. She says information keeps communities orderly. Then she told me something that made my stomach tighten. Vivian's balcony renovations 2 years earlier had included commercial observation glass imported through a Denver contractor. High magnification, privacy tint from outside, clear visibility from inside. Suddenly, every uneasy feeling Elise ever had inside this house came rushing back all at once. The blinds, the anxiety, the way she stopped gardening near the lakeside of the property because she always felt watched. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while thunder rolled low over the water beyond the fog. Elise had spent the last year of her life believing she was becoming paranoid. What if she was right the entire time? That question nearly broke me. But grief changes shape after enough years. It stops being sharp and becomes heavy instead. Heavy enough to build decisions on. When I finally pulled into my driveway, another crowd had formed across the street, pretending not to stare. 2 residents immediately lowered their voices when my truck tires crunched over the wet gravel. One man actually stepped backward into his garage the second I looked at him. Then Vivian herself appeared at the top of the ridge near her stone walkway, holding a white coffee mug like she had been waiting for me to arrive. Even from uphill, I could see that polished smile fixed carefully into place. "Morning, Grant," she called down casually. "Still enjoying your little wall?" Little wall. Interesting wording from somebody so obsessed with removing it. I leaned against the truck door and looked up at her balcony windows reflecting gray storm clouds over the lake. "You take a lot of pictures from up there?" Her smile flickered almost invisibly. There it was again. Tiny crack. Tiny panic. But she recovered fast. People notice unusual things in a neighborhood. That works both ways. Silence settled between us while cold wind rattled tree branches overhead. Somewhere below, a boat horn echoed once through the fog. Then Vivian lifted her mug slightly and said the most revealing thing yet. "Careful, Grant. Privacy can make people suspicious. Not safety. Not legality. Suspicious. Because in Vivian Holloway's world, the moment somebody blocked her view was the moment they stopped being manageable." The next 48 hours changed the entire temperature of the neighborhood. Not publicly at first. Places like Lakeview Ridge never explode all at once. They curdle slowly behind closed garage doors and careful smiles. By Tuesday morning, people were still jogging past my property, pretending to focus on the lake trail. But now they kept glancing uphill toward Vivian's balcony too. Once suspicion enters a wealthy community, everybody starts recalculating old memories. I noticed it immediately. Residents who used to avoid eye contact with me now looked nervous around her instead. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Rain clouds hung low over Blackwater Lake all week, trapping cold, damp air against the shoreline until every morning smelled like wet cedar, mud, and gasoline from fishing boats warming up at the marina. Around 9 that morning, I was replacing hinges on the side gate when a silver SUV rolled halfway into my gravel driveway and stopped. Sandra Pike stepped out holding a grocery bag against her chest like she regretted being seen there already. Sandra lived 3 houses down from Vivian and had barely spoken to me in 2 years beyond polite waves. "I cannot stay long," she said quietly before I could answer. Her eyes kept drifting uphill toward the ridge houses. "Vivian watches from those windows." That sentence alone told me more about this neighborhood than any HOA document ever could. Sandra handed me the bag. Inside was a binder wrapped in plastic grocery sacks to protect it from rain. "My husband kept records," she whispered. "After he died, I stopped caring enough to fight her." Then she looked me directly in the eye for the first time. "You still do." Inside the binder were printed emails, violation notices, complaint timelines, handwritten notes. Years of them. Different homeowners. Different excuses. Same pressure pattern every single time. One family received noise complaints after refusing to sell part of their shoreline easement. Another couple got buried under landscaping citations after objecting to Vivian entering their backyard without permission during an inspection. But one page stopped me cold. A contractor invoice from Denver. Observation-grade architectural glass installation. 2 years ago. Same timing Elise began complaining about feeling watched. My hands actually trembled slightly holding that page. Not from fear anymore. Recognition. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake while rain tapped softly against the workshop roof, and Sandra stood there exhausted from carrying secrets too long. "Why now?" I finally asked her. She gave a sad little laugh. Because people only stay quiet until they realize silence is feeding the wrong person. Then she left before anybody could see her truck parked near my house too long. By afternoon, the social pressure escalated again. Somebody filed another anonymous complaint claiming my fence created hostile visual conditions for neighboring properties. Hostile visual conditions. That phrase almost made me laugh. At the same time, 3 different residents suddenly canceled attendance for the upcoming HOA Landscaping Committee dinner hosted at Vivian's house. One excuse involved illness. Another claimed family obligations. The third simply texted maybe next time. Fear was weakening, and Vivian felt it. She proved that around sunset when she appeared unannounced at my driveway wearing a camel-colored raincoat and carrying a pie dish like we were old friends. The performance almost impressed me. Thought we got off on the wrong foot, she said warmly while fog drifted thick over the lake behind her. Neighborhood harmony matters to me. She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. People are starting to gossip, Grant. That never ends well for anyone. There it was beneath the smile. Not apology. Containment. I looked at the pie dish. Bakery label still attached underneath. Store-bought. You came all the way down here in the rain to warn me about gossip. Her expression tightened for half a second. I came to remind you this community survives on cooperation. Funny, I said calmly. It sounds more like surveillance. The silence after that stretched long enough for rainwater dripping from the cedar fence to become the loudest sound between us. Then Vivian looked past me toward the backyard, toward the fence, toward the part of my property she could no longer see through. And for the first time since this started, I saw something underneath all that polished control. Not anger, hunger. The kind powerful people get when access disappears. She smiled again, but this time it looked tired. You really do not understand what you are interfering with. Then she walked back uphill through the fog while thunder rolled low across the water again. And standing there in the cold evening air with that binder under my arm, I finally realized this was never about aesthetics, property values, or HOA rules. Vivian Holloway had built an entire social ecosystem around watching people. And my fence had just blinded the person who needed visibility most. By Thursday morning, the rain finally stopped, but the pressure in Lakeview Ridge somehow felt heavier without it. Fog still drifted low over Blackwater Lake, hanging between the shoreline docks and the ridge houses like the entire neighborhood was trapped inside one long-held breath. I stood at my kitchen counter before sunrise with Sandra Pike's binder spread open beside 3 legal pads full of notes I had barely slept enough to write. Coffee had gone cold hours earlier. The old version of me would have kept reacting emotionally to Vivian Holloway's intimidation. The exhausted widower. The homeowner trying to protect memories. But sometime during that sleepless week, something shifted quietly inside me. Fear stopped driving the decisions. Structure started driving them instead. And structure was something I understood very well. By 8:30, I was sitting inside a conference room above a lakeside engineering office 2 towns over with a structural consultant named Raymond Kessler, studying topographic overlays of my property spread across a walnut table. Rainwater still dripped occasionally from the gutters outside, tapping against the windows while boats moved slowly through the fog below the shoreline. Raymond adjusted his glasses and looked at the elevation map again. Your lot is unusual, he said carefully. Most people up there cannot legally obstruct view corridors because of shared visibility easements. Yours is exempt. I already suspected that part. But then he said something better. Technically, your property qualifies for reinforced visual privacy architecture under shoreline reflection standards. He slid a code manual across the table toward me. Not fencing. Architectural shielding. There it was. The opening. Not emotional retaliation. Not revenge rage. Classification. Language controls liability in America more than truth ever does. Fence disputes are neighborhood drama. Architectural shielding tied to privacy mitigation and reflective shoreline compliance becomes county-protected infrastructure. Completely different battlefield. Raymond kept talking while thunder rumbled faintly over distant mountains. If somebody can establish repeated visual intrusion from elevated structures overlooking a protected residential lot, the county usually prioritizes privacy mitigation over aesthetic objections. Elevated structures. Vivian's balcony. Her observation glass. Her photographs. Suddenly, all her own behavior became evidence against her. That realization sent a strange calm through me, stronger than anger had ever been. Around noon, I stopped at a diner near the county marina while waiting for another appointment. Quiet place. Mostly contractors and fishermen drinking burnt coffee under fluorescent lights while weather reports played softly over the counter television. I noticed two county employees sitting in a booth near the back discussing Lakeview Ridge in low voices. They stopped the second they saw me enter. One of them actually muttered, "That HOA situation is getting ugly." Ugly. Interesting word. Not non-compliant. Not illegal. Ugly. Meaning Vivian was beginning to lose narrative control outside the neighborhood too. Halfway through my sandwich, my phone buzzed with a neighborhood alert. Emergency HOA compliance hearing. Mandatory attendance encouraged. Hosted by Vivian Holloway. Of course it was. Public pressure phase. She wanted spectacle back before fear slipped any further. But this time I did not feel cornered reading her message. I felt prepared. By late afternoon, I sat inside another office overlooking the muddy shoreline access road near County Route 12 while an insurance liability specialist reviewed copies of Sandra's binder and the photograph Vivian left at my door. The woman reading them lowered the papers slowly and said, "If an HOA officer knowingly used elevated observation equipment to monitor neighboring properties without disclosure, there are serious civil exposure concerns here." Civil exposure. Another useful phrase. Another layer of pressure. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Has your HOA insurance carrier been informed any of this exists?" I almost smiled for the first time all week. Because suddenly I understood the real danger to Vivian Holloway. Not county fines. Not gossip. Liability panic. Wealthy HOA boards fear embarrassment second. They fear insurance collapse first. That evening I returned home just as fog swallowed most of the lake again and lights flickered on across the ridge houses one by one through the mist. Residents stood on porches pretending not to watch my driveway. Curtains shifted everywhere. The social atmosphere had completely changed now. People no longer looked at me like the unstable homeowner with the ugly fence. They looked at me like the man who might expose something everybody had quietly tolerated for years. Then I noticed another envelope tucked beneath my front door. Inside was the official hearing agenda for Saturday night. Vivian's name signed neatly at the bottom in blue ink. Final compliance determination regarding visual obstruction and neighborhood damages. Damages. I stood there listening to wind move through the wet cedar boards while thunder rolled softly over the lake again. Then I looked uphill toward Vivian's glowing balcony windows cutting through the fog above the ridge and realized something that probably should have terrified me more than it did. She still thought this was a hearing about my fence. She had no idea it was about to become a hearing about her. Saturday night arrived under heavy storm clouds that turned Blackwater Lake almost black beneath the ridge. Wind pushed fog across the shoreline in slow waves while headlights crawled steadily toward the Lakeview Ridge clubhouse through the wet dark like people driving toward a funeral they were pretending was a community meeting. I parked near the far end of the gravel lot and sat inside the truck for a moment listening to rain tick softly against the windshield and distant thunder rolling over the mountains. 3 days earlier, I would have walked into that building defensive, angry, maybe even desperate. Now I walked in carrying a leather portfolio and a kind of calm that made people nervous. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee, wet jackets, and nervous silence. Residents filled nearly every folding chair, but the atmosphere felt wrong immediately. Too quiet. Too careful. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was socializing near the snack table like they usually did before HOA meetings. Instead, people sat facing forward, avoiding eye contact with Vivian Holloway, who stood near the podium in a cream blazer, holding a stack of papers against her chest with that same polished smile she always wore when she believed control still belonged to her. But something had changed. The room no longer moved with her. You could feel it. Conversation stopped when she approached now instead of beginning. Fear had shifted directions. Vivian opened the hearing with her usual performance voice. Calm, cultured, slightly wounded. This community has always valued openness, trust, and neighborhood harmony, she said while rain rattled softly against the clubhouse windows overlooking the lake. Unfortunately, certain recent actions have created division and hostility. Certain recent actions. Interesting phrasing from somebody who had spent years weaponizing surveillance and intimidation. I noticed Sandra Pike sitting near the back row staring down at her hands while two board members whispered tensely beside the refreshment table. Even they looked uncomfortable now. Vivian continued speaking about aesthetics, property values, visual cohesion. But every sentence sounded thinner than the one before it because people were no longer hearing confidence. They were hearing management. Then she made the mistake that finally cracked the room open. Some homeowners, she said carefully, mistakenly believe privacy concerns justify disruptive architectural behavior. Privacy concerns. A few heads turned toward me immediately, and then toward Vivian's balcony visible through the rain-streaked clubhouse windows up on the ridge beyond the lake. Nobody said anything. That silence hit harder than shouting ever could. When Vivian finally invited me to respond, her smile looked strained around the edges for the first time since this started. I stood slowly, opened the portfolio, and placed 3 photographs onto the front table without saying a word at first. One showed the zoomed image she left at my house. Another showed the observation glass invoice Sandra gave me. The third showed the direct sight line from Vivian's elevated balcony into multiple neighboring backyards along the shoreline. You could actually hear somebody near the middle row whisper, "Oh my God." Vivian's face did not collapse immediately. People like her are too practiced for that. Instead, she tried smiling through it. "Grant," she said softly, almost maternal now, "surely you are not implying ordinary neighborhood oversight is inappropriate." Oversight. There was the real word finally. Not community. Not aesthetics. Oversight. I looked directly at her and answered calmly enough that half the room leaned forward to hear it. I think people deserve to know when somebody turns privacy into a management tool. Absolute silence. Rain hammered the roof harder overhead, while lake wind rattled the windows along the back wall. Then came the social shift that truly ended her authority. One of the older residents near the front row stood up slowly and asked Vivian whether she had photographed his grandchildren while they swam last summer. Another homeowner asked if balcony visibility records existed for other lots too. A third demanded to know whether HOA insurance had been informed about potential surveillance exposure. Suddenly, the room was no longer listening to Vivian. It was examining her. And for the first time all night, she stopped speaking for nearly 4 full seconds because she realized something horrifying in real time. The community she controlled had begun comparing notes. The room never recovered after that question about the grandchildren. You could feel the atmosphere physically changing inside the clubhouse like pressure dropping before a storm breaks. People who had spent years nodding along with Vivian Holloway suddenly started looking at each other instead of at her. That was the real danger for someone like Vivian. Not accusations. Alignment. Once frightened people realize they were isolated on purpose, they start finding courage in clusters. Rain slammed harder against the windows overlooking Blackwater Lake, while fog swallowed most of the shoreline outside, turning the glass into gray mirrors reflecting anxious faces back into the room. Vivian tried regaining control fast. "This has become wildly inappropriate," she said sharply, abandoning the warm community tone completely now. Private architectural enhancements are not illegal. Architectural enhancements. Interesting how quickly surveillance became architecture when liability entered the conversation. One of the board members beside her quietly removed his glasses and rubbed both hands over his face like a man realizing he should have retired years earlier. Another avoided looking at Vivian entirely. Then Sandra Pike stood up. Slowly. Nervously. But she stood. "You photographed my backyard too," she said, voice trembling slightly. "After my husband's stroke." The silence after that felt enormous. Vivian blinked once. "Sandra, that is an unfair characterization. You told me visibility protects community standards." Sandra's eyes filled immediately, though she kept speaking. "You knew I was alone and overwhelmed." More movement across the room now. Heads turning. People whispering. Somebody near the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." And then the institutional collapse finally arrived. The clubhouse doors opened and cold lake wind swept rainwater across the tile floor as 2 county officials stepped inside, followed by Sheriff Nolan Briggs, still wearing a wet brown jacket from the storm outside. Nobody had called deputies for violence. That was not why he came, which somehow made it worse. Administrative presence carries a different kind of humiliation in wealthy communities. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat slowly and scanned the room before speaking. "We need to pause this meeting immediately." Vivian straightened at once. On what authority? Still polished. Still trying. But her voice had lost the effortless control underneath it now. One of the county officials opened a folder and answered for him. Pending review of potential civil exposure involving unauthorized visual monitoring complaints tied to HOA governance practices. The room erupted into overlapping whispers. Civil exposure. Governance practices. Those words hit the room like thunder. Vivian actually laughed once in disbelief. Short. Sharp. This is absurd. But nobody agreed with her anymore. That was the part she could not process. The social gravity had shifted completely. Sheriff Briggs looked exhausted more than aggressive. Miss Holloway, county administration received multiple resident statements tonight along with supporting documentation. Until legal review concludes, the board is advised to suspend enforcement actions connected to this matter. Suspend enforcement actions. In one sentence, her authority effectively collapsed in public. One homeowner quietly clapped once before stopping awkwardly. Another resident immediately stood and demanded access to HOA financial disclosures tied to surveillance equipment expenditures. Then another asked whether insurance carriers had been informed yet. Board members started speaking over each other. Somebody near the front row simply walked out shaking his head. Through all of it, Vivian stood frozen near the podium, gripping her papers too tightly while rain hammered the clubhouse roof overhead. And for the first time since I met her, she looked old. Not physically. Structurally, like the invisible machine she spent years building around herself had suddenly stopped working, and she no longer understood how to exist without it. Then her eyes found mine across the room. Not angry now. Cornered. You did this deliberately, she said quietly enough that only I could really hear it. I answered just as calmly. No, Vivian. You built this deliberately. I just stopped pretending not to see it. Outside, thunder rolled across Blackwater Lake again while residents gathered into nervous little groups throughout the clubhouse, whispering names, dates, stories, memories, comparing experiences, comparing fear. And standing there listening to that low rising noise beneath the storm, I realized something almost sad. Vivian Holloway had spent years watching everyone else so closely that she never noticed the moment the entire neighborhood finally started watching her back. 3 weeks after the clubhouse hearing, Lakeview Ridge felt like a neighborhood waking up after a long illness. The storms finally moved east, but cold fog still drifted over Blackwater Lake most mornings, sliding low across the muddy shoreline and wrapping itself around the fishing docks before sunrise. The difference now was the silence. Not fearful silence. Reflective silence. The kind that settles over a place after people realize how much pretending they had been doing. Vivian Holloway stopped appearing on her balcony after county investigators formally requested access to HOA communication records and surveillance-related expenditures. Her social media posts disappeared first. Then the neighborhood newsletters stopped. Then came the emergency board suspension notice taped quietly to the clubhouse doors one rainy Tuesday afternoon while residents stood under umbrellas pretending not to read every word twice. Nobody defended her publicly anymore. That part almost shocked me more than the investigation itself. Fear evaporates fast once people realize power was mostly performance. By early October, moving trucks began appearing outside Vivian's house at odd hours. Quietly. No farewell party. No neighborhood gathering. Just hired labor carrying framed artwork and expensive furniture down wet stone steps, while rain drummed softly against the metal roofs across the ridge. I watched from my workshop window one morning while restoring Elisa's old cedar potting bench with fresh stain and new brass hinges. First real project I had touched in months that did not involve legal strategy or evidence folders. The smell of sawdust and cedar oil filled the garage again instead of stress. Funny how a home changes once it stops feeling observed. Around noon, there was a knock at my open garage door. Sheriff Briggs stood there holding a coffee thermos, fog curling behind him from the lake trail. County closed the preliminary review this morning, he said carefully. The HOA insurance carrier is conducting its own audit now. He looked around the workshop for a moment before adding quietly, "A lot of folks around here think you did them a favor." I almost laughed at that because none of this had felt heroic while living through it. Mostly it felt exhausting. But exhaustion and dignity are not the same thing. That took me a while to remember. Later that evening, several neighbors stopped by for the first real conversation anyone had attempted in months. No agendas, no whispers, just coffee cups, folding chairs, and cold lake wind moving through the trees while people talked openly for once. Sandra Pike cried halfway through telling a story about her late husband. Dale Morrow brought smoked trout from the marina. Somebody even joked about the infamous fence finally becoming the safest structure in Colorado. The laughter sounded awkward at first, then genuine. Across the ridge, Vivian's balcony remained completely dark. Empty windows staring out over fog and shoreline lights with nobody standing behind them anymore. Near sunset, I walked alone down the stone path behind my property toward the dock Elise loved most during late October mornings. The lake was calm for the first time in weeks, soft ripples moving beneath silver fog, while distant thunder faded somewhere beyond the mountains. I stood there breathing cold cedar air and realized I could finally hear the water again without listening for footsteps above me. That might sound small to some people. It was not small to me. A month later, the county approved my revised architectural privacy installation request without objection. Not just the cedar fence anymore. Reinforced reflective glass shielding rated for shoreline glare mitigation and residential privacy protection. 60 feet long. Clean lines. Nearly invisible from the lake during daylight. From Vivian's old balcony, though, the structure reflected only sky, fog, and whoever stood staring at it. Poetic justice has a funny way of looking almost peaceful from a distance. The final irony came during the winter HOA election when 3 longtime residents ran on a transparency platform and won by landslide margins. No more private enforcement committees. No more discretionary inspection authority. No more observation policies disguised as neighborhood standards. People applauded when the results were announced inside the same clubhouse where Vivian once controlled every conversation in the room. And me? I spent that night alone in the workshop while snow mixed lightly with rain outside and soft yellow light reflected across freshly organized tools hanging neatly back where they belonged. Elise's restored bench sat near the window overlooking the shoreline. The fence stood quiet beyond it. The lake wind moved gently through the cedar trees. No drones. No photographs. No eyes from the ridge. Just peace. But every now and then, especially on foggy mornings when the water disappears beneath the clouds and the whole shoreline turns gray and still, I still catch myself glancing once toward that dark balcony uphill. Because some people do not just lose power when they are exposed. They lose identity. And men who worked county investigations for 30 years will tell you the same thing every time. The most dangerous moment is not when controlling people are powerful. It is when they finally realize nobody is watching them anymore.